Hi all, welcome to this video on culture. So we're going to be looking at culture from the perspective of international business and international business management. So the first stage is really to develop our understanding of culture. So starting from a definition of culture and then looking to explore that definition and some of the taxonomies of culture that we can develop. So if we start with um, developing our definition of culture. So, what is culture? It is deeply contested, so this is important to note. Just as we discussed during globalization, certain terms will mean very different things to certain people. And that's not just a disagreement on the precise meaning, but it's usually reflective of broader differences in outlook, broader differences in how we perceive the world, or the value that we, or the differing values that we place on different aspects of the world that we see. So it is deeply contested, but we can develop some kind of definition. So the simplest definition would be the influence that's exerted over us through family, friends, and the broader community. So the culture, so the kind of influence that we have exerted over us will differ vastly depending on the kind of family and social networks and broader community that we have. Um, we can develop this more, however, so that influence isn't just exerted in the form of direct requests. It's not, culture isn't just the things that you're asked to do. It's also the embedded beliefs, the values, the unspoken and spoken rules, as well as the community and social institutions that produce an individual that isn't necessarily told explicitly to behave in a certain way, but rather has learned through various means that this is the way to behave, has become socialized within a particular community. So within this definition, we can understand culture really as being the glue which allows individuals to function within a broader community in a way that they're aligned, broadly speaking, with the same general values, with the same beliefs, with the same norms of behavior, without having to necessarily have explicit enforced rules. So the structure of society, the behaviors and norms have become internalized. That is a useful start point for a definition, but there are other elements as well. So artistic expression is usually understood as an important part of culture. So we use culture in a few different ways, but one of those ways is to say that culture is artistic expression. So when we talk about a cultured individual, we're talking about an individual that is broadly read, for example, has perhaps artistic expression themselves, or certainly appreciates artistic expression in others. So culture is very strongly connected to art, whether it's music, whether it's literature, whether it's cinema, whether it's painting or drawing or various other things. We can certainly see the connection between art and culture. Uh, Alongside of this, we can see culture as being bound up or expressed, let's say, in behavioral patterns and tics. So things which may be connected to deeper cultural beliefs, or may just be happenstance, may just be a particular quirk of a particular culture. So a classic example is greeting. So whether it's shaking hands or bowing or other forms of greeting, this is something which is usually culturally determined. So again, tying back into what we spoke about earlier with regards to internalizing norms of behavior. So we can say that they really are two distinct types of expressions of culture, how culture is expressed and visible in the real world. Firstly, it would be individual expressions, so expressions of culture that we can identify from individual behavior, so internalized norms, attitudes, beliefs, values, and their actual behavior itself. These all bear the hallmarks of cultural influence. Now, this isn't to say that culture dictates people's norms, attitudes, beliefs, values, and behavior. This is absolutely not the case. But rather, it has a strong influence over these elements. So, if we take a particular person, let's say they're Indian or Japanese or Russian or a particular culture, if you know their cultural background, you absolutely cannot predict their attitudes, beliefs, values, or behavior. That's not understanding the variance of humanity. An individual from Japan may be hot tempered or patient. An individual from India may be outgoing or introspective. I mean, human variance is human variance regardless of your cultural background. So we're not saying that culture will dictate these elements in individuals, but rather culture exerts a significant influence over them. So your attitudes, for example, or your beliefs on what is or isn't acceptable behavior bear the hallmarks of culture. Whether you abide by those norms, the degree to which you abide by those norms, the degree to which you interpret those norms, there's going to be significant variance in those things, but a general understanding of what the cultural norm is regarding particular attitudes and beliefs is likely to be shared. So we have a significant exertion of influence by culture, but this doesn't translate into one-to-one translation into being able to predict people's behavior and beliefs and so on. But that would very much be an individual expression of culture in all of those elements. Secondly, we have institutional expressions of culture. So these are expressions of culture which we can see in institutional form by either broader societal institutions, political institutions like governments and other governance governing bodies, educational institutions, economic business institutions, which is obviously of particular interest to us, and they will also have similar markers of culture, whether it's in markers of expected behavior within the institutions, the rules, regulations of the institutions themselves, an expression in the physical environment of the institutions. These are all likely to bear cultural markers also. So if we move on to the last part of this video, which is exploring the iceberg concept of culture, which does tie in a lot of what we're just discussing. So this is breaking culture down into three distinct elements, each of which exert a different influence upon us. It's called the iceberg concept because the first two, high culture and folk culture, the expressions of high culture and folk culture are very, very evident to us. They're very obvious to us. And we're able to see that there's a distinct difference in different countries' high culture and different countries' folk culture. However, that accounts for a relatively small part of cultural expressions or the elements which culture exerts an influence over, and deep culture represents the larger part of cultural expression. However, deep culture is also invisible. So when you're aware of deep culture and its role in norms, beliefs, values, and behavior, it can be very obvious, but otherwise it's fairly invisible. We're not, we don't see someone and go instantly, oh, their deep culture is different from ours. It has to be observed, it has to be understood. So just like an iceberg, the majority of cultural expression is hidden, while the smaller part is visible. So if we look at an expression of this, or these are just examples, we'll start from the top. So high culture. So these are things which in national cultures and different societies tend to prize as the best expressions of themselves. So if we take literature, for example, William Shakespeare in English culture tends to be an example of prized high literature, representing the best of English literature. We can say the same thing for classical music, so we can look at Wagner as a expression of German high culture and a celebrated expression of German high culture at that. Drama, we can look at Japanese theatre, expressing again a valued part of Japanese national culture. So these things tend to be very obvious, and we're aware of the place that high culture plays in various national communities' imaginings. And there's quite a few reasons for this. It tends to be because it's an expression of pride or joy in achievement within those particular communities. But they're very distinct and different. It's very obvious to spot differences in high culture between different countries. The next element, which is still above the surface, i.e., is still relatively straightforward and easy to spot, would be differences in folk culture. So this is culture as expressed not through formalized means or artistic expression, or rather, celebrated artistic expression, but rather everyday and commonplace expressions amongst ordinary people. So we can see dress, for example, is evidently different, and that's part of folk culture. So national dress is usually distinctly different. We can talk about business dress and why business dress tends to be the same all around the world. For example, if you're a man and you're working at a certain level of business, regardless of your cultural background, it's likely that you wear a variation of a suit and tie and a suit jacket. But there's distinct reasons for that. So if you exclude that kind of globalized business dress, there are obvious differences in traditional dress between countries, between eclectic rites of passage, folk dancing, cooking. So national cuisines tend to be very obviously different as well. You're aware of eating Indian food as opposed to Italian food. It's relatively obvious and simple to spot. So again, above the iceberg, not above the iceberg, above the surface, it's relatively clear. Popular music is part of this as well. So popular music, rather than classical or celebrated expressions of high art, all of these tend to be relatively straightforward. Courtship practice and games and mythology, again, all contribute to this expression of folk culture. So this is culture not as a prized example of achievement within a particular country, as high culture often is, but culture as it's lived day to day by people within that society. Now, the third element in the iceberg concept of culture is the largest portion, and this is not very visible. So this is deep culture. So unlike the way people dress or the particular unique aspects of their humor or the food that they cook, deep culture can be very, very difficult to spot. So you can have people from different cultural backgrounds who are dressed identically in this case and eating the same food and enjoying the same music, but who may have very, very different elements of deep culture, so very different embedded beliefs and values which can be ascribed to their cultural background or cultural influence, but are not immediately visible or obvious. So these can be kind of non-verbal communication ties and tics. So different cultures would have different styles of non-verbal communication. And we have this. There's things that we think are universal, but are not necessarily universal. So nodding your head up and down to mean yes and shaking it side to side to mean no is not a universal form of non-verbal communication, but is culturally bound. And we have some cultures which do not share this understanding of nodding your head means yes and shaking your head means no. Conceptions of beauty as well are very much culturally bound. So things or aspects of physical appearance which are considered beautiful do vary from country to country, from culture to culture. Body shapes vary as well. Some cultures would have a preference or would believe that certain body shapes are more beautiful than others. Same thing goes for facial features, same thing goes for skin tone, hair types, hairstyle. All of these things are very much culturally bound. Again, we may believe that these there is universality in beauty and what we find beautiful, but actually, if you examine the differences in what is considered beautiful in different cultures, there's significant difference. We have to understand that globalization is impacting deep culture. So there are some elements of deep culture. Sorry, is impacting culture. So there's certainly elements of folk culture which are aligning. Humor, for example, and music and dancing are very much being affected by globalization, and they are moving closer together in some ways due to globalization, due to global forms of entertainment like Hollywood, global forms of entertainment and exchange in the arts, books and TV shows. But lots and lots of elements of deep culture are still very much distinctly different. Gender roles, again, there are some changes because culture isn't stagnant, culture isn't fixed, culture is dynamic, evolving, and moving. So there may be differences in family relationships and gender roles from now than how it was in a particular culture, say 50 or 60 years ago. But this isn't to say that gender roles are now universal. They are still culturally bound. They're strongly influenced by cultural background. And this isn't to necessarily talk about the way people behave, but rather how they understand gender roles, or how they conceive of gender roles is strongly influenced by culture. So you can have, for example, let's say two men who cook for their families. One could be from a culture where this is seen as perfectly normal, that men and women partake on a more equitable basis when it comes to household chores. So cooking for his family alongside of his wife is perfectly normal. Another man can also be cooking for his family, but he perceives this as an extraordinary circumstance. So his wife, they need the money, so his wife has to work. So because his wife has to work, they have to share the cooking. But this is because of their need for money or some kind of unique circumstance. But the role of the wife is to cook and clean, and the role of the husband is to leave and go to work and earn money. So you see there, even though the behavior is the same, both men are cooking dinner for their families, their conception of gender roles can be very different. So we shouldn't think that gender roles, family relationships, and some of the other elements here in deep culture are based upon the way people actually act. But rather it's their conceptions of these kind of very primal values and beliefs and norms. So they can behave in a different way. They can behave that way because they could be living in a different culture, so they're abiding by the norms of a different culture. They could perceive that there's some kind of extraordinary circumstance which makes them act in a different way. So there's all kinds of reasons why people behave the way they do. But with deep culture, we're talking about the way people understand these elements, internalized norms, internalized beliefs, things which we don't necessarily even question. Someone who has a particular understanding of family relationships doesn't necessarily sit there and say, this is what I believe about families, but rather it's built into the way they think of family. It's the associations that come up when they think of mother, father, son, daughter, and so on.